Mentioned at the top of the service, we today are celebrating Ascension Sunday. As we just heard, the ascension of Jesus into heaven. That means that next Sunday, Pentecost Sunday, where the Spirit comes upon the apostles, is the official end of the Easter season. Now, the readings that we heard from today, they are not the readings for today, for the seventh Sunday of Easter. These are the readings from this past Thursday, because the Ascension is celebrated 40 days after Easter, which falls on a Thursday. Many of you growing up in the church, especially if you grew up in the Catholic Church, celebrated Ascension Thursday, because that's really when the Ascension falls. Now, Ascension is 40 days after Easter, and as most of you know, Lent is the 40 days before Easter. So what is this whole thing with the number 40? Well, we know 40 shows up so many times in the Bible. We know that the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. We know Moses was on top of Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights, receiving the 10 Commandments. We know that Jonah was in Nineveh for 40 days. We know that in the Noah's Ark story, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And Jesus, we know, was in the wilderness for 40 days and nights before he began his ministry. So this is not a coincidence that this number keeps appearing. It's not an accident. The scripture writers are using this number on purpose. For the ancient Jewish people, numbers were spiritual and symbolic, not literal. They weren't saying that Jesus, for example, was literally in the desert for 40 days. 40 is symbolic. And what it symbolically means or spiritually means is a time of spiritual completion. It's the time it takes for the workings of the Spirit to be made manifest. It's the time it takes for new growth and new life, new spiritual life. Now, some have said that the scripture writers chose 40 because pregnancy is 40 weeks long, from conception to birth. So that's what the symbolism of 40 is. Now, if you've been with us through the Easter season, you know that we've been hearing stories about Jesus appearing to the apostles after his death. And during that time that he's with them, he is giving them what's known as the farewell discourse. Because before he leaves them, he's giving them his final words, his final teachings. And as we just heard, it says, before he ascended into heaven, he opened up their minds to understanding all the scriptures. He had to open their minds to understand the scriptures before he could leave them. So my question for you is, if the stories in scripture are literal stories, what's there to open up your mind about? I mean, if the stories of Adam and Eve and Moses and Noah, if they're all literal stories, why do you have to open your mind to understand them? Wouldn't they just be easily understood? I've told you before, the stories in Scripture are not to be understood literally. The ancient writers, the Scripture writers, wrote stories symbolically. I've shared this quote with you before because it's one of my favorites. It's from John Dominic Crossan. He was one of the famous theologians of the Jesus Seminar in the 1970s and 80s. He's one of the leading voices today in the progressive Christian movement. And this is his quote. He says, "My point is not that the ancient people wrote stories literally, and now we're smart enough to understand them symbolically. My point," he says, "is that the ancient people wrote stories symbolically, and now we're dumb enough to understand them literally." The stories are symbolic, and so Jesus needs to open up the minds of the apostles to understand the scripture. And once they understand it spiritually, They become filled with the Spirit themselves, and Jesus then can ascend. Jesus then can leave them. In fact, Jesus says in John's Gospel, the Spirit cannot come to you unless I leave you. So that right there is the ascension story. And Jesus then ascends. Now, when we talk about Jesus' ascension, what exactly are we talking about? You know, many of you have seen beautiful works of art depicting the ascension. In fact, I shared one of them in the epistle newsletter this week, if you get our weekly newsletter. And in most of those paintings, you see Jesus rising up into the clouds, and the apostles are all looking up at the sky as he rises in astonishment. So did that really happen? I mean, did Jesus really defy the law of gravity and rise up bodily into the sky? Well, Bishop John Shelby Spong, one of the leading biblical scholars of our day, says somewhat sarcastically about the ascension. He says, "Do you think Jesus went up past the moon and perhaps took a left at Mars?" And Father Richard Rohr, who wrote the Words of Integration and Guidance this morning, in fact, he is going to be interviewed by Oprah today on her own network. So when you get home, you can watch it. But Father Richard Rohr says, the ascension, we should not take this story to mean there was a rocket ship Jesus. He says, this is not a beam me up Scotty moment. Okay? Now, that said, John Shelby Spong wasn't there, Richard Rohr wasn't there, and I wasn't there. So is it possible that Jesus literally, physically rose up into the sky? Sure. Anything's possible with God. But my job, Richard Rohr's job, John Shelby Spong's job, Jesus' job was to open up people's minds to understanding the Scripture, to have people look at the words of Scripture symbolically, spiritually. That's what I want us to do with this story. If we just take it literally, that's the lowest level of meaning. How could we expand our minds about that? So let's look at it symbolically. Jesus has died, and after his death, the apostles are locked together in the upper room. The upper room symbolizes a place of higher consciousness. And in that place of higher consciousness for 40 days, which again is symbolic. It's the time it takes for the Spirit to do its work. During that 40 days of pregnancy, they are feeling the presence of the Christ in a very real way. They are having their minds opened to understanding the spiritual realm. That's what's happening to them. And so Jesus then ascends. He leaves them because they are already now filled with the Spirit, which we're going to talk about next Sunday during Pentecost. Now, Jesus ascended into heaven. Where is that? Is it up in the clouds, all the way up there? Well, what did Jesus say about heaven? He never said it was up in the clouds. Jesus said, these are his exact words, he said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. That's where Jesus went. That's where Jesus ascended. So what the ascension story is the apostles getting that understanding that, wow, the Christ is within us. That's what the ascension is all about. It is that merging of the human with the divine, the arising or awakening to that understanding. Christ is in me. That's where Christ ascended. And I am to, along the spiritual path, rise to my understanding of my own divine nature, of my own Christ consciousness. Now, if you were with us last Sunday, I was talking about how most people on the planet are dwelling at a very low level of consciousness. They have not ascended. They haven't risen in their spiritual journey or in their spiritual understanding. So, for example, They're dwelling in lack and limitation. But the ascension story is to remind us that we need to return home to dwell in the kingdom, not to dwell in lack, but to dwell in the kingdom and to rise to abundance. Instead of dwelling in hatred, we return home and we go to that higher place of love. Instead of dwelling in things like darkness, we again return to that higher place and we go to a place of love. Instead of dwelling in separation, in brokenness, in dis-ease, we return back to that higher place of health and wholeness, holiness. That's what the story means. If we just understand it as Jesus physically in his body went up into the clouds, what's there to make meaning of that? But the story is for us a spiritual story, and it's about you. It's not about Jesus. As Father Rohr said, Jesus didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted you to follow him. He wanted you to do as he did. To awaken to that Christ consciousness within you, and to arise, and to awaken, and to ascend to that. So that's what we are celebrating today. Now, despite what you may be seeing on the news or feeling, I do believe that many people on the planet are ascending. They are awakening in consciousness. And I believe we've seen that in our country just in the past couple of years. More and more people, their eyes are being opened. Their minds are being opened. They are seeing things in a new light, and they are awakening. So what I want to tell you is, don't dwell in a low place. The ascension story reminds us we are to ascend. We're supposed to be lifting up our hearts and minds, not to dwell in that place of hopelessness, but to arise to this hope, to this new light. The Spirit is at work. I promise you that. So that's what this story today reminds us all to do this week, is to ascend, arise, lift up our hearts and minds. Because when we lift up, we are also lifting up the world. And when we lift up the world, we are bringing about the kingdom of heaven here on earth. That's the ascension story. Namaste.